The alphabet. The alphabet represents one of the most profound cognitive technologies ever created by humans. Unlike earlier systems of communication based on images, gestures, or complex symbols, the alphabet reduced language to a small set of abstract signs that corresponded to sounds rather than meanings. This shift fundamentally altered how the human mind processed information, structured thought, and understood reality itself. Before the alphabet, most forms of writing were logographic or pictographic. Symbols represented objects, actions, or ideas directly. These systems required extensive memorization and encouraged holistic, context-dependent thinking. Meaning was tightly bound to imagery and cultural interpretation. The alphabet broke this connection. By representing speech at the level of individual sounds, it detached meaning from symbols and reorganized language into a linear, sequential system. This abstraction had deep cognitive consequences. The alphabet trained the human brain to process information in ordered sequences rather than interconnected images. Thought became more analytical, decomposed into parts that could be rearranged, compared, and evaluated. Language no longer flowed primarily through memory and oral tradition but through structured symbols that demanded attention to order, syntax, and logic. Alphabetic writing also externalized thought in a new way. Spoken language disappears as soon as it is produced, relying on memory for preservation. Alphabetic text remained stable. Ideas could now exist independently of the speaker, unchanged by repetition or time. This stability allowed humans to return to thoughts, examine them, and refine them. Reflection became possible on a scale never before achieved. As alphabetic systems spread, they reshaped education and cognition. Learning to read required training the brain to recognize abstract symbols, connect them to sounds, and assemble them into meaning. This process strengthened neural pathways associated with pattern recognition, sequential processing, and focused attention. Literacy gradually reconfigured how people perceived language itself, not as sound alone, but as a system that could be analyzed, dissected, and reconstructed. The alphabet also altered the structure of memory. In oral cultures, memory was trained to preserve vast amounts of information through repetition, rhythm, and storytelling. Alphabetic writing reduced the need for memorization and shifted cognitive effort toward interpretation and analysis. Memory became external, stored in texts rather than minds. This allowed individuals to engage with more complex ideas without being limited by recall alone. Over time, alphabetic thinking encouraged categorization and definition. Concepts could be named precisely, separated from context, and discussed in isolation. This precision enabled the development of formal logic, law, philosophy, and systematic inquiry. Ideas could be debated based on their internal consistency rather than authority or tradition. The alphabet did not create rational thought on its own, but it provided a structure that supported it. Another key transformation introduced by the alphabet was linear time perception in thought. Alphabetic text is read from beginning to end, reinforcing cause and effect reasoning and chronological organization. Events could be recorded in sequence, arguments built step by step, and narratives constructed with clear progression. This reinforced a sense of continuity and direction in both personal reasoning and collective history. The alphabet also standardized language. Variations in pronunciation and expression could be fixed into written form. This created shared reference points across regions and generations. Meaning became less dependent on immediate social context and more reliant on agreed systems of representation. As a result, communication became more precise but also more detached, allowing ideas to circulate far beyond their origin. Importantly, the alphabet changed not only what humans thought about but how they thought. It favored abstraction over intuition, analysis over immediacy, and structure over fluidity. These cognitive tendencies gradually shaped institutions, governance, and intellectual traditions. The alphabet trained minds to operate within frameworks, rules, and systems that could be transmitted and preserved. Despite its simplicity, the alphabet imposed discipline on thought. Writing required clarity. Ambiguity became visible. Contradictions could be identified. Ideas could be revised, criticized, and improved. This self-correcting capacity marked a fundamental change in human cognition. Thought was no longer ephemeral. It could be inspected and reshaped. The alphabet did not eliminate older forms of thinking, but it rebalanced them. Oral intuition, visual imagination, and emotional expression remained, yet they increasingly operated alongside alphabetic reasoning. The human mind became hybrid, combining symbolic abstraction with lived experience. This balance defined much of later intellectual development. In this sense, the alphabet was not merely a tool for communication. It was a cognitive technology that rewired perception, memory, and reasoning. By transforming speech into symbols and symbols into systems, it reshaped the architecture of thought itself. Long before machines or electricity, the alphabet quietly redefined what it meant to think as a human. Paper. Paper represents a quiet but decisive transformation in how humans think, record knowledge, and organize reality. While writing systems made abstract thought possible, paper made that abstraction practical, flexible, and widespread. It did not change the content of human thought as much as it changed the way thought could be handled, shaped, and accumulated over time. Before paper, writing materials were limited, heavy, expensive, or fragile. Stone, clay tablets, parchment, and papyrus imposed constraints on how much could be written and how often ideas could be revised. Thought tended to be deliberate, final, and formal. Paper removed many of these limitations. It was lightweight, inexpensive, and easy to produce in large quantities. This physical accessibility reshaped the relationship between the mind and written expression. Paper allowed thought to become provisional. Ideas no longer had to be fully formed before being recorded. Notes, drafts, sketches, calculations, and corrections became normal. The act of thinking could unfold on the page itself. Writing turned into a cognitive process rather than a final product. Humans began to think with paper, not merely on paper. This shift had significant consequences for reasoning. Complex ideas could be broken down into parts, rearranged, compared, and refined. Lists, tables, diagrams, and margins emerged as tools for organizing thought. The page became a workspace for the mind, extending cognitive capacity beyond biological limits. Problems that exceeded working memory could now be managed through external structure. Paper also changed the temporal nature of thinking. Ideas could be paused, resumed, and revisited without loss. Thought no longer depended on continuous attention. A person could return to the same page days or years later and continue where they left off. This continuity supported long-term projects, systematic inquiry, and cumulative knowledge building. The availability of paper transformed education. Learning shifted from memorization toward interaction with written material. Students could annotate texts, copy passages, and practice writing extensively. Mistakes became less costly, encouraging experimentation and refinement. This reduced the psychological barrier to intellectual risk and fostered deeper engagement with ideas. Paper further altered how information was stored and trusted. Records could be archived, categorized, and referenced. Administrative systems expanded as documentation became central to governance, trade, and law. Reality itself increasingly relied on written proof. Contracts, receipts, letters, and records shaped social and economic relationships. Thought adapted to a world where legitimacy was often determined by what existed on paper. The cognitive effect of paper extended into abstraction and planning. Calendars, maps, blueprints, and financial ledgers allowed humans to model reality symbolically before acting within it. Decisions could be simulated rather than improvised. This encouraged foresight, calculation, and strategic thinking. The future became something that could be outlined and adjusted rather than merely anticipated. Paper also introduced distance between thought and emotion. Writing on paper slowed expression, allowing reflection and control. Emotional reactions could be processed, revised, or restrained before becoming permanent. This moderation influenced diplomacy, philosophy, and personal correspondence. The written word gained authority precisely because it was less immediate and more deliberate. As paper spread, it supported the expansion of institutions that depended on documentation. Bureaucracy, science, finance, and education all relied on the ability to store, reproduce, and organize written material. Human thinking increasingly aligned with these systems. Precision, consistency, and traceability became valued cognitive traits. Importantly, paper reshaped the relationship between individuals and collective knowledge. Libraries, archives, and later printed materials allowed access to thoughts far removed from one's own experience. The mind became accustomed to learning from silent sources rather than direct interaction. This reinforced independent reasoning and internal dialogue. Paper also normalized the idea that thought could be private. Personal notes, journals, and drafts created spaces where ideas could exist without immediate social exposure. This privacy encouraged introspection and self-analysis. Inner thought became something that could be externalized without being shared. Despite its simplicity, paper subtly disciplined cognition. It imposed boundaries, margins, and structure. Ideas had to fit within space, lines, and order. This physical constraint shaped clarity and prioritization. What was written mattered. What was omitted mattered as well. Over time, paper became so integrated into daily life that its cognitive influence became invisible. Yet its role was foundational. It transformed thought from something fleeting and spoken into something iterative, organized, and enduring. It allowed humans not only to preserve ideas, but to work on them continuously. Paper did not replace the mind. It extended it. By serving as a stable surface for thinking, it enabled complexity, continuity, and accumulation on a scale impossible through memory alone. Long before digital systems, paper quietly redefined how humans reasoned, planned, and understood the world. The compass. The compass represents a fundamental shift in how humans perceive space, direction, and their relationship to the unknown. Before its widespread use, navigation relied primarily on memory, landmarks, celestial observation, and accumulated experience. Movement through the world was contextual and local. The compass introduced an abstract, constant reference that existed independently of terrain, visibility, or familiarity. This seemingly simple device reshaped human spatial thinking at its core. By providing a stable indication of direction, the compass detached orientation from immediate sensory cues. Direction became a concept rather than an experience. North, south, east, and west were no longer inferred through surroundings but identified through an instrument. This abstraction trained the human mind to trust symbolic information over direct perception. Navigation shifted from intuitive recognition to measured alignment. This change altered how humans constructed mental maps. Previously, space was remembered as a sequence of places connected by experience. With the compass, space could be organized as a continuous grid governed by fixed directions. Movement became calculable. Routes could be planned in advance, adjusted systematically, and repeated reliably. The mind adapted to thinking in terms of coordinates rather than stories. The compass also transformed confidence in exploration. Unfamiliar environments no longer implied disorientation. Direction remained stable even when landmarks disappeared. This reliability reduced psychological dependence on known paths and encouraged outward movement. Humans became more willing to venture into open seas, deserts, and forests. Exploration became less personal and more procedural. Cognitively, the compass strengthened abstract spatial reasoning. It required users to mentally align internal intention with external reference. Travelers learned to maintain direction even when motion or environment suggested otherwise. This reinforced discipline in thought, favoring consistency over immediate sensory feedback. The mind learned to operate with delayed confirmation rather than instant reassurance. The introduction of the compass also reshaped collective understanding of geography. Space became something that could be shared, standardized, and communicated accurately. Directions could be written, drawn, and followed by others. This reduced reliance on individual memory and experience. Knowledge of space became transferable and cumulative. The compass influenced planning and anticipation. Journeys could be envisioned before they began. Routes were no longer reactive but intentional. This encouraged foresight and contingency thinking. Navigation became a mental exercise in probability, adjustment, and correction. Humans began to think of movement as a problem to be solved rather than a path to be remembered. Over time, compass-based thinking reinforced the idea that the world operated according to underlying rules that could be accessed through tools. Trust shifted from perception to instrumentation. This mindset extended beyond navigation. Humans grew accustomed to relying on devices that revealed hidden structure beneath surface experience. The compass contributed to a broader cognitive acceptance of mediated reality. The psychological impact of this shift was subtle but persistent. Direction ceased to be personal and became universal. Everyone using a compass shared the same reference points. This encouraged a sense of objectivity in spatial understanding. The world appeared more orderly, predictable, and navigable. The compass also reduced cognitive load during movement. Instead of constantly interpreting surroundings, travelers could rely on a single reference. This freed mental resources for planning, observation, and decision-making. The mind became less occupied with orientation and more focused on strategy. Importantly, the compass altered how humans perceived error. Losing one's way became a correctable deviation rather than a failure of memory. Navigation errors could be identified and adjusted methodically. This reinforced problem-solving behavior and tolerance for uncertainty. Mistakes became part of a controlled process. The compass did not eliminate intuitive navigation, but it subordinated it to abstract guidance. Experience remained valuable, yet it was now supplemented by an external authority. Human cognition adapted to balancing internal judgment with instrumental instruction. This balance became a model for later technologies. Over generations, compass use normalized the idea that invisible forces could provide reliable information. Magnetism itself was unseen, yet trusted. This acceptance of unseen but measurable phenomena shaped cognitive openness to concepts beyond direct experience. The compass ultimately redefined humanity's relationship with space. It transformed movement from memory-based wandering into structured navigation. It trained minds to think in fixed directions, abstract references, and plan trajectories. Through this shift, humans learned to orient themselves not only in the world, but within systems that extended beyond immediate perception. The steam engine. The steam engine marked a turning point in how humans understood power, work, and time. Before its adoption, energy was tied closely to natural limits. Human labor, animal strength, wind, and water defined what could be done and when it could be done. The steam engine introduced a new model of power, continuous, controllable, and independent of immediate environmental conditions. This shift profoundly altered human thinking. For the first time, energy became something that could be generated on demand. Power was no longer seasonal or location-bound. This changed how humans planned activity. Work could be scheduled rather than adapted. Time became something to be filled with output rather than followed according to natural rhythms. The human mind adjusted to a world where productivity was expected to be constant. The steam engine also transformed the concept of work itself. Physical effort was no longer the primary measure of productivity. Machines amplified input far beyond human capability. This introduced a new way of thinking about efficiency. Output could be calculated, compared, and optimized. Labor became abstract, measured in units rather than effort. Humans began to think in terms of capacity and throughput. This abstraction extended into perception of the human role. People were increasingly viewed as operators rather than performers of work. Cognitive effort shifted toward coordination, supervision, and timing. The mind adapted to managing systems instead of performing tasks directly. This change laid the foundation for procedural thinking. The steam engine reinforced linear causality. Input produced predictable output. Adjustments produced measurable changes. This reliability encouraged mechanical reasoning. Problems were approached as systems with identifiable variables. This mindset influenced not only engineering but broader approaches to organization and planning. Time perception changed dramatically. Before mechanized power, work followed daylight and weather. With steam, time became segmented and regulated. The clock gained authority. Human thinking aligned with schedules, shifts, and deadlines. Time was no longer experienced passively but managed actively. The steam engine also reshaped spatial thinking. Production was no longer tied to rivers or wind patterns. Facilities could be placed based on efficiency rather than geography. This encouraged centralized planning and concentration of activity. Space became something to be organized around output rather than nature. Cognitively, the steam engine introduced scale. Processes could be expanded without proportional increases in human effort. This challenged intuitive understanding of cause and effect. Small inputs could produce massive outcomes. The human mind adapted to thinking beyond direct proportionality. The reliability of steam power reinforced trust in engineered systems. Humans became accustomed to delegating force to machines. This delegation reshaped responsibility. Failures were attributed to systems rather than individuals. Thinking shifted toward maintenance, control, and prevention. The steam engine also normalized noise, motion, and constant activity. Environments became dynamic and mechanical. The human nervous system adapted to sustained stimulation. Silence and stillness became less central to work. Mental focus adjusted to operate amid continuous motion. Importantly, steam power altered expectations. Growth became assumed. Increased output became a baseline rather than an exception. Human thinking adjusted to continuous improvement. Stability was replaced by expansion as a default goal. The steam engine also influenced how humans understood limitation. Physical exhaustion was no longer the primary boundary. Constraints were technical rather than biological. This encouraged problem-solving approaches aimed at overcoming limits rather than accepting them. Over time, steam-driven systems reinforced hierarchical organization. Coordination of machines required structured control. Decision-making became centralized. Human cognition adapted to roles defined by systems rather than individual autonomy. The steam engine did not simply add power. It restructured thought around productivity, predictability, and scale. It trained minds to expect constant energy, measurable output, and controllable processes. Long before electricity or digital technology, steam power rewired how humans understood work, time, and their own role within systems. The factory system. The factory system introduced a fundamental reorganization of human thinking about work, time, and individuality. While earlier technologies changed what humans could do, factories changed how humans understood their role within productive systems. Work was no longer defined by skill alone, but by position, repetition, and coordination within a larger structure. This shift deeply altered cognition and behavior. Before factories, production was often artisanal and holistic. A single person or small group controlled an entire process, from beginning to end. This encouraged contextual understanding and personal responsibility for outcomes. The factory system replaced this model with division of labor. Tasks were broken into discrete, repetitive actions. Thought adapted accordingly. Workers no longer needed to understand the whole, only their specific function. This fragmentation of labor reshaped mental focus. Attention narrowed. Repetition trained the mind to operate within limited parameters. Predictability became valued over improvisation. The factory system rewarded consistency rather than creativity. Human cognition adjusted to precision, timing, and endurance. Time perception shifted further. Factories required synchronization. Individual rhythms were subordinated to collective schedules. Bells, shifts, and regulated hours structured daily life. Thinking became increasingly oriented toward external timekeeping rather than internal cues. Time was experienced as a resource controlled by systems, not by individuals. The factory system also transformed identity. A person's role became defined by function rather than craft. Individuals were interchangeable within processes. This introduced a new cognitive relationship between self and work. Personal identity became detached from output. Work was something performed within a system, not an expression of self. This change influenced responsibility and agency. Outcomes were no longer attributable to one person. Success and failure became systemic. Human thinking adapted to shared accountability. Errors were addressed through process adjustment rather than personal correction. This reinforced analytical thinking focused on systems rather than individuals. Factories also normalized hierarchy. Decision-making was centralized. Instructions flowed downward. Workers learned to follow procedures rather than make judgments. Cognitive effort shifted from decision-making to compliance and execution. This trained minds to operate under external control structures. The physical environment of factories further shaped cognition. Noise, motion, and repetition created a sensory backdrop that required mental filtering. Attention became selective. Humans learned to focus narrowly amid constant stimulation. This adaptation influenced later tolerance for industrial and urban environments. The factory system reinforced quantitative thinking. Output was measured, compared, and optimized. Numbers replaced narratives as indicators of success. Human cognition increasingly aligned with metrics. Productivity became abstract and measurable, separate from lived experience. Planning and management emerged as distinct cognitive roles. Some individuals focused on oversight, optimization, and coordination. This separation reinforced strategic thinking at higher levels and procedural thinking at lower levels. The human mind adapted to layered cognitive structures within organizations. Factories also influenced expectations of learning. Skills were standardized and taught quickly. Training emphasized repetition rather than mastery. This reshaped how humans approached education and skill acquisition. Learning became task-specific rather than comprehensive. Importantly, the factory system normalized monotony. Repetition became acceptable, even expected. The human mind adapted to sustained routine. This tolerance reshaped patience, endurance, and attention span in structured environments. The factory system also influenced social thinking. Cooperation was no longer voluntary but enforced by structure. Humans learned to function within impersonal systems. Relationships became professional rather than personal. Interaction was mediated by roles and schedules. Over time, factory logic extended beyond production. The same principles shaped offices, schools, and institutions. Standardization, schedules, and division of labor became default cognitive frameworks. Human thinking increasingly mirrored the systems it inhabited. The factory system did not merely organize labor. It organized thought. It trained humans to think in terms of processes, efficiency, hierarchy, and replaceability. This cognitive shift defined modern organizational life and reshaped how individuals understood work, time, and themselves within larger systems. Photography film. Photography film introduced a new way for humans to relate to reality, memory, and evidence. Unlike earlier visual representations created by hand, photographic film captured light itself. This shift fundamentally altered how humans trusted images, remembered events, and interpreted the past. Reality could now be mechanically recorded rather than interpreted through human perception alone. Before photographic film, visual memory relied on recollection, description, or artistic representation. Images were subjective, shaped by intention and interpretation. Photography introduced a perception of neutrality. The camera appeared to remove the human hand from representation. This encouraged the belief that images could show reality as it truly was, independent of opinion or narrative. This belief reshaped cognitive trust. Humans began to treat photographs as evidence rather than illustration. Seeing became equivalent to knowing. The mind adapted to accepting visual records as authoritative. Memory shifted from internal recollection to external confirmation. Events were remembered not as experiences but as images. Photography film also changed how time was perceived. Moments could be frozen, isolated, and preserved. The continuous flow of experience was divided into discrete fragments. Humans began to think of life as a series of moments rather than an uninterrupted process. This fragmentation influenced how people remembered the past and anticipated the future. The ability to capture a moment encouraged selective attention. Events were increasingly experienced with the expectation of documentation. The mind learned to identify what was worth recording. This altered perception itself. Experiences were filtered through their potential to become images. Photography film externalized memory in a durable form. Personal and collective histories became visual archives. This reduced reliance on narrative memory and increased dependence on recorded images. Over time, memories were reconstructed around photographs rather than lived sensation. The photograph often replaced the experience it represented. This shift also introduced distance between the observer and the observed. Holding a camera positioned the individual outside the moment. Experience became mediated. The act of observation gained priority over participation. The mind adapted to viewing reality through frames, boundaries, and compositions. Photography film influenced how humans understood truth. Images appeared objective, yet they were framed, timed, and selected. This tension trained cognitive awareness of perspective without eliminating trust. Humans learned to balance belief in images with interpretation, even as images retained strong persuasive power. The reproducibility of photographic film amplified its impact. Images could be copied, shared, and distributed widely. Collective memory became standardized. Events were remembered through shared visual references. This reduced variation in interpretation while reinforcing dominant narratives. Photography film also reshaped identity. Individuals could see themselves as others saw them. Self-image became externalized. The mind adapted to evaluating identity through visual representation. Appearance gained cognitive importance as a stable record rather than a fleeting impression. The permanence of photographic records altered behavior. Actions were performed with awareness of potential documentation. This introduced self-monitoring and restraint. The mind adjusted to an environment where moments could be preserved indefinitely. Photography film influenced emotional processing. Images allowed repeated exposure to past moments. Emotions could be revisited, reinforced, or dulled over time. Memory became less fluid and more fixed. The past gained visual solidity that resisted reinterpretation. In scientific and institutional contexts, photographic film reinforced visual verification. Observation became standardized. Phenomena could be recorded and examined repeatedly. This supported analytical thinking and reduced dependence on subjective testimony. The presence of photographs also changed how absence was felt. People and places could be visually present even when physically distant. This altered emotional attachment and perception of loss. Images maintained connection while emphasizing separation. Photography film normalized the idea that reality could be stored. Life became archivable. This introduced a cognitive relationship with the past based on preservation rather than transformation. Change became visible through comparison rather than memory. Importantly, photography film altered the boundary between public and private experience. Personal moments could become public records. The mind adapted to managing exposure and visibility. Identity became something that could be displayed, shared, and evaluated visually. Photography film did not simply capture images. It redefined perception, memory, and trust. It trained humans to see the world as recordable, moments as preservable, and reality as something that could be frozen and revisited. Through this shift, human thinking became increasingly visual, archival, and mediated by recorded evidence. The typewriter. The typewriter introduced a mechanical relationship between thought and written language that permanently altered how humans composed, structured, and finalized ideas. While handwriting allowed fluid movement between thinking and writing, the typewriter imposed structure, rhythm, and irreversibility. This transformation reshaped not only how text was produced, but how thought itself was organized. Before the typewriter, writing was closely tied to the body. Handwritten text reflected speed, emotion, hesitation, and individuality. Corrections were visible, revisions were costly, and writing often unfolded slowly. The typewriter disrupted this intimacy. Letters became uniform. The hand no longer shaped symbols directly. Thought passed through a machine before becoming text. This mediation changed cognitive pacing. Typing encouraged faster production of words. Ideas appeared more quickly on the page. reducing the delay between intention and expression. The mind adapted to continuous output. Writing became less contemplative and more linear. Momentum replaced deliberation as a dominant cognitive state. The typewriter also imposed finality. Errors were difficult to correct. Each keystroke committed thought to paper. This constraint trained precision. Writers learned to compose sentences mentally before producing them physically. Thought became pre-structured. Planning shifted inward, emphasizing clarity before execution. Uniform typography altered perception of authority. Typed text appeared formal, official, and impersonal. Meaning became detached from the writer's physical presence. This encouraged objectivity. The reader focused on content rather than handwriting. The mind learned to separate ideas from their originator. The standardization of letters influenced language itself. Sentences became shorter, clearer, and more direct. Complex flourishes declined. Writing adapted to mechanical rhythm. The structure of thought aligned with the structure of the machine. This reinforced logical sequencing and reduced ambiguity. The typewriter changed revision habits. Drafting required intention. Multiple versions were planned rather than improvised. This encouraged hierarchical thinking. Texts were constructed through layers of refinement rather than spontaneous adjustment. Thought became modular and ordered. The mechanical sound and rhythm of typing influenced concentration. Writing became a physical cadence. This rhythm supported sustained focus. The mind synchronized with repetition. Distraction decreased as motion became automatic. This supported long-form reasoning and extended composition. The typewriter also separated writing from literacy skill. Legibility was no longer dependent on penmanship. This democratized written authority. Individuals could produce professional-looking documents regardless of handwriting ability. Cognitive emphasis shifted from form to content. In institutional contexts, the typewriter reshaped administration and communication. Documents multiplied. Records became standardized. Thought within organizations adapted to documentation. Decisions were justified through typed records. Memory became procedural and archived. The typewriter influenced how writers perceived their own work. Typed text felt external and finished. This distance encouraged critical evaluation. Writers could assess their ideas more objectively. Thought gained detachment from emotion. The machine also altered gendered labor patterns, but cognitively it reinforced role specialization. Writing became operational. Thought was processed through roles and procedures. This normalized cognitive delegation. The permanence of typed pages influenced self-censorship. Knowing that words were difficult to erase encouraged restraint. Thought became filtered before expression. This reinforced internal editing and control. The typewriter also reinforced linearity. Text moved forward relentlessly. Revisiting earlier sections required physical effort. This encouraged forward-thinking logic. Ideas were built sequentially rather than cyclically. As typewriters spread, they normalized mechanical mediation of thought. Writing was no longer purely human. The mind adjusted to collaborating with machines. This relationship prepared cognition for later digital interfaces. Importantly, the typewriter changed how ideas were shared. Typed documents traveled easily and were copied reliably. Collective thinking became standardized. Variation decreased. Consensus increased. The typewriter did not simply speed up writing. It restructured thinking around clarity, finality, and order. It trained humans to precompose thoughts, commit to decisions, and communicate with precision. Long before computers, the typewriter disciplined the mind to operate within mechanical constraints, shaping modern written cognition. Radio broadcasting. Radio broadcasting introduced a form of communication that fundamentally altered how humans perceived presence, authority, and collective experience. For the first time, a single voice could reach millions of people simultaneously without requiring physical proximity. Sound was detached from location. This transformation reshaped how humans processed information, formed opinions, and understood shared reality. Before radio, communication across distance relied on written text or delayed transmission. Information arrived slowly and was often mediated through interpretation. Radio replaced delay with immediacy. Events could be described as they happened. The human mind adapted to receiving information in real time, creating a new sense of simultaneity. People who never met could now experience the same moment together. Radio restored the dominance of the voice, but in a new form. Unlike face-to-face speech, radio voices were disembodied. They carried no visible source, yet conveyed emotion, confidence, and authority. This altered how trust was formed. Listeners learned to assess credibility through tone, rhythm, and clarity rather than physical presence. Authority became auditory rather than visual. This shift had deep cognitive effects. The human mind evolved to associate voices with individuals. Radio disrupted this association. A voice could represent institutions, nations, or abstract entities. This encouraged identification with unseen speakers and reinforced symbolic authority. Thought adapted to accepting guidance from sources that could not be personally verified. Radio broadcasting also transformed attention. Listening required sustained focus without visual support. The mind learned to construct internal images from sound alone. This strengthened imagination while reinforcing linear reception. Unlike reading, radio could not be paused or reread. Information flowed forward continuously. Attention became temporal rather than spatial. The inability to control pacing altered cognitive behavior. Listeners adapted by prioritizing key points and relying on repetition. Memory adjusted to transient input. What was missed was gone. This reinforced passive reception rather than active analysis. The mind learned to absorb rather than interrogate information. Radio created a shared cognitive environment. Large populations received the same messages at the same time. This synchronized perception and emotion. News, music, and announcements shaped collective mood. Individual interpretation became secondary to shared experience. Thought aligned with common narratives reinforced through repetition. The intimacy of radio further amplified its influence. Voices entered private spaces. Information was received in homes, often in moments of rest. This reduced psychological distance between the speaker and the listener. Messages felt personal even when directed at masses. The mind adapted to blending private emotion with public discourse. Radio also altered the rhythm of daily life. Schedules adjusted to broadcasts. Certain hours became associated with news or entertainment. Time was structured around listening. This reinforced habitual attention and anticipation. Cognitive routines formed around programmed information flow. The absence of visual verification influenced belief formation. Without images, listeners relied on description and authority. This encouraged trust in narrative framing. Events were understood through language rather than evidence. The mind adapted to constructing reality from sound alone. Radio broadcasting reshaped emotional processing. Music and speech transmitted emotion directly. Collective reactions formed rapidly. Joy, fear, and reassurance spread through sound. Emotional synchronization became possible across vast distances. Thought and feeling aligned at scale. Radio also reduced individual control over information selection. Content was curated centrally. Listeners received what was broadcast. This reinforced acceptance of external agendas. Cognitive autonomy weakened in favor of guided attention. The one-to-many structure of radio reinforced hierarchical communication. Few spoke. Many listened. This normalized passive reception. Thought patterns adapted to listening rather than responding. Dialogue became internal rather than external. Despite its limitations, radio expanded awareness beyond local environments. People thought in national and global terms. Events far away became psychologically immediate. Spatial distance lost emotional weight. The world felt smaller and more interconnected. Radio broadcasting also influenced language itself. Speech became standardized. Accents softened. Vocabulary adapted for clarity and mass comprehension. Thought followed suit. Ideas were simplified to reach broad audiences. Complexity gave way to accessibility. Importantly, Radio normalized the idea that reality could be narrated live. Interpretation happened as events unfolded. This reduced reflection time. Immediate framing shaped understanding before analysis could occur. The mind adapted to forming judgments quickly. Radio did not eliminate reading or visual thinking, but it shifted balance toward auditory authority and collective perception. It trained humans to listen together, feel together, and respond together. Through this shared auditory space, radio broadcasting reshaped attention, trust, and the experience of belonging to a larger whole. Computers. Computers introduced a fundamental transformation in how humans process information, solve problems, and understand thinking itself. Unlike earlier machines that amplified physical power, computers amplified cognitive processes. They did not simply assist the mind. They reshaped the way the mind approached logic, memory, and decision-making. Before computers, calculation, classification, and complex analysis were constrained by human cognitive limits. Even with tools like paper and mechanical devices, thinking remained slow, sequential, and effortful. Computers introduced speed and scale that exceeded intuitive understanding. Operations that once required hours or days could now be completed instantly. This altered expectations of what thinking should produce and how quickly results should appear. Computers externalized logic. Processes that were once internal, reasoning, sorting, comparison, were translated into instructions executable by machines. This required humans to formalize thought. Ambiguity had to be reduced. Instructions had to be explicit. The mind adapted to expressing ideas in precise, unambiguous steps. Thinking became procedural. This procedural framing influenced problem-solving. Problems were broken down into smaller units that could be processed sequentially. The concept of an algorithm entered everyday cognition. Humans learned to think in terms of inputs, processes, and outputs. Solutions were no longer intuitive leaps but structured sequences. Computers also transformed memory. Information could be stored externally in vast quantities, accessed instantly, and retrieved without degradation. This reduced the need for internal recall. Human memory shifted from retention to navigation. The mind adapted to remembering how to find information rather than storing it directly. Cognitive effort moved toward selection and interpretation. The reliability of computers reinforced trust in calculated outcomes. Results produced by machines appeared objective and precise. This encouraged reliance on computation over judgment. Human thinking adjusted to deferring decisions to data-driven processes. Intuition became secondary to numerical output. Computers reshaped attention. Screens presented information in discrete units. Multitasking became normalized. The mind learned to switch rapidly between tasks rather than sustain focus on one. This fragmented attention but increased responsiveness. Thinking adapted to constant interruption and parallel processing. The interface between human and machine further influenced cognition. Keyboards, screens, and later graphical interfaces created standardized ways of interacting with information. Thought became mediated through layers of abstraction. Direct manipulation was replaced by symbolic interaction. This reinforced conceptual rather than tactile understanding. Computers also altered expectations of accuracy. Errors became identifiable and correctable. Mistakes were no longer permanent. This encouraged experimentation. Humans became more willing to test ideas, revise outputs, and iterate rapidly. Thought became less cautious and more exploratory within structured environments. The speed of computation changed temporal perception. Waiting decreased. Results were expected immediately. This compressed decision cycles. The mind adapted to rapid feedback. Deliberation shortened. Efficiency became a cognitive value. Computers influenced how humans understood complexity. Systems with thousands of variables could be modeled and analyzed. This expanded conceptual horizons. Phenomena once considered too complex became manageable. Thinking adjusted to operating within models rather than direct observation. The use of computers also reinforced abstraction. Data represented reality symbolically. Numbers, graphs, and simulations replaced direct experience. Humans learned to trust representations over perception. Reality was increasingly understood through mediated forms. Computers normalized automation. Repetitive cognitive tasks were delegated to machines. This changed the human role from performer to supervisor. Thinking shifted toward oversight, exception handling, and system design. Responsibility became indirect. The presence of computers in work environments reshaped organizational thinking. Decisions relied on reports, metrics, and models. Qualitative judgment gave way to quantified evaluation. Human cognition aligned with performance indicators and dashboards. Computers also influenced learning. Information became interactive and dynamic. Trial and error accelerated. Feedback loops shortened. The mind adapted to learning through exploration rather than memorization. Knowledge became modular and updatable. Importantly, computers altered the definition of intelligence. Tasks once considered uniquely human, calculation, pattern recognition, optimization, were performed by machines. This forced a reevaluation of human cognitive identity. Thinking was no longer defined by capability alone but by interpretation and context. Computers did not replace human thought, but they restructured it. They trained humans to think formally, rely on data, and operate within systems of abstraction. By externalizing logic and memory, computers reshaped cognition to align with machines. This shift laid the foundation for modern digital thinking and permanently altered how humans approach knowledge, work, and decision-making. Video games. Video games introduced an interactive form of media that fundamentally altered how humans relate to challenge, learning, and failure. Unlike passive technologies that deliver information in one direction, video games require continuous input, decision-making, and adaptation. This interactivity reshaped cognitive expectations and trained the mind to operate within feedback-driven systems. Before video games, most structured learning environments treated failure as something to be avoided. Errors carried social or practical cost. Video games normalized failure as an expected and necessary part of progress. The mind adapted to repeated trial and error. Loss became temporary. Persistence replaced avoidance. This altered emotional responses to difficulty and reshaped motivation. Video games trained procedural thinking. Players learned systems by interacting with them rather than by instruction alone. Rules were discovered through action. Cause and effect became experiential. The mind adapted to learning by doing, internalizing mechanics through repetition and adjustment. Understanding emerged gradually, grounded in feedback rather than explanation. This process strengthened adaptive cognition. Players constantly adjusted strategies based on outcomes. Success depended on recognizing patterns, predicting consequences, and refining behavior. Thinking became iterative. Decisions were evaluated quickly, and strategies were revised continuously. The mind learned to operate within dynamic systems. Video games also reshaped attention. They demanded sustained focus while processing multiple streams of information simultaneously. Visual cues, sound, timing, and spatial awareness had to be integrated in real time. This trained selective attention and rapid prioritization. Cognitive load increased, and the mind adapted to managing it efficiently. The structured nature of game environments influenced goal-oriented thinking. Objectives were clearly defined. Progress was measurable. Feedback was immediate. This clarity reinforced motivation and engagement. The mind learned to associate effort with visible advancement. Abstract goals became concrete through points, levels, and progression systems. Video games also changed how humans perceived agency. Actions produced immediate and observable consequences within the game world. This reinforced a sense of control. The mind adapted to environments where effort reliably influenced outcomes. This feedback loop strengthened confidence in problem-solving within structured systems. The presence of rules influenced moral and strategic thinking. Games established boundaries within which behavior was allowed. Players learned to optimize within constraints. This encouraged analytical thinking focused on efficiency and exploitation of systems rather than moral evaluation. The mind adapted to rule-based environments where success depended on understanding mechanics rather than intentions. Video games normalized simulation. Virtual worlds operated according to internally consistent logic. The mind learned to treat representations as functional realities. Decisions carried meaning within these systems despite their artificial nature. This strengthened the ability to engage with models and abstractions. The repetition inherent in games influenced patience and endurance. Tasks were often repeated many times to achieve mastery. The mind adapted to incremental improvement. Small gains accumulated into skill. This reinforced long-term engagement rather than immediate reward alone. Video games also altered time perception. Players frequently entered states of deep focus where awareness of external time diminished. This trained sustained engagement. The mind adapted to operating intensely within defined periods. Time became elastic within immersive systems. Social dimensions of video games influenced collective cognition. Cooperation and competition required anticipation of others' actions. Strategic thinking extended beyond the individual. The mind adapted to shared objectives, coordination, and comparison. Performance was evaluated relative to others, reinforcing benchmarking behavior. Failure in games was depersonalized. Losing did not imply inadequacy. It signaled the need for adjustment. This reduced emotional resistance to correction. The mind learned to separate outcome from identity. Improvement became procedural rather than personal. Video games also introduced layered complexity. Simple mechanics combined to create emergent behavior. Players learned to manage systems with interacting variables. This trained systems thinking. Outcomes were understood as products of interaction rather than single causes. The reward structures of games influenced motivation. Variable reinforcement encouraged continued engagement. Progression systems reinforced habit formation. The mind adapted to operating within engineered motivational loops. Effort became aligned with structured incentives. Video games changed how learning was evaluated. Mastery was demonstrated through performance, not explanation. Knowledge was practical and embodied. The mind adapted to valuing competence over articulation. Importantly, video games altered expectations of feedback. Immediate response became normal. Delayed evaluation felt inefficient. This reshaped patience and planning. The mind adapted to environments where consequences followed actions quickly. Video games did not replace other forms of thinking, but they introduced a cognitive mode centered on interaction, adaptation, and persistence. They trained humans to engage with systems actively, to fail productively, and to learn through continuous feedback. Through this process, video games reshaped how the human mind approaches challenge, progress, and mastery within structured environments. The credit card. The credit card introduced a profound shift in how humans perceive value, spending, and the relationship between present action and future consequence. Unlike earlier forms of money, the credit card separated payment from physical exchange. This separation reshaped cognitive processing around cost, ownership, and responsibility. Before credit cards, transactions were tangible. Money was counted, exchanged, and physically reduced. Spending involved a visible loss. This directness reinforced awareness of limitation. The credit card removed this immediacy. Payment became symbolic. The act of spending no longer produced an immediate sense of depletion. The mind adapted to a delayed understanding of cost. This delay altered decision-making. Purchases could be made without immediate consequence. The future absorbed responsibility for present actions. Human thinking shifted toward short-term satisfaction supported by deferred accountability. The temporal boundary between action and outcome weakened. The abstraction of money intensified. Value became numerical rather than physical. Numbers on a statement replaced coins and bills. This encouraged conceptual rather than sensory evaluation of spending. The mind processed cost as data, not loss. Emotional resistance decreased as transactions became frictionless. Credit cards also redefined ownership. Goods could be possessed before being paid for. This inverted traditional exchange logic. Possession no longer signaled completion. Obligation persisted invisibly. The mind adapted to holding simultaneous states of ownership and debt. This duality normalized cognitive dissonance in everyday transactions. The regular cycle of statements introduced a new temporal rhythm. Spending accumulated silently and was reviewed later. Reflection was postponed. This reduced immediate self-regulation. Cognitive control shifted from moment-to-moment restraint to periodic assessment. Financial awareness became episodic rather than continuous. Credit cards also changed risk perception. The presence of a limit created an artificial boundary. Spending decisions were framed relative to available credit rather than actual resources. The mind adapted to treating limits as permission rather than warning. This reframed constraint as capacity. The psychological distance from money altered emotional responses. Pain associated with spending diminished. Studies later observed reduced physiological responses during card transactions compared to cash. The mind adapted to reduced emotional feedback, increasing spending frequency and size. Credit cards reinforced trust in systems rather than individuals. Transactions depended on networks, institutions, and records. The user relied on invisible processes. This normalized faith in abstract financial infrastructure. Thinking shifted from personal accountability to systemic assurance. The ease of recurring payments further altered cognition. Costs blended into background routines. Spending became passive. The mind adapted to continuous obligation without active decision-making. Financial awareness declined as attention shifted elsewhere. Credit cards also influenced identity. Creditworthiness became a measure of reliability. Numbers represented trust. Individuals internalized external evaluation. The mind adapted to viewing financial behavior through metrics rather than personal judgment. The separation between consumption and labor widened. Spending no longer felt directly connected to effort. This weakened the intuitive link between work and reward. The mind adapted to a more abstract economic relationship where value flowed through systems rather than direct exchange. Credit cards normalized future-oriented debt. Borrowing became routine. The stigma of debt diminished. Obligation was reframed as planning. The mind adapted to viewing future income as already allocated. This reshaped anticipation and expectation. The convenience of credit encouraged impulse behavior. Decisions required less deliberation. The mind adapted to faster approval processes. Frictionless action became standard. Reflection became optional rather than necessary. At the same time, credit cards increased record-keeping. Every transaction was logged. Financial behavior became traceable. The mind adapted to being observed indirectly. Accountability shifted from internal awareness to external documentation. Credit cards also influenced social norms. Spending patterns became less visible. Status could be displayed without obvious means. The mind adapted to decoupling appearance from resources. This increased comparative thinking and reduced transparency. Importantly, credit cards altered how humans understood obligation. Debt became continuous rather than discrete. Responsibility was distributed over time. The mind adapted to carrying invisible commitments as a background state. The credit card did not change what humans valued, but it changed how value was experienced. It replaced physical exchange with symbolic action, immediate consequence with delayed reckoning, and restraint with abstraction. Through this shift, human thinking adapted to a world where spending felt light, obligation felt distant, and responsibility was managed through systems rather than sensation. Advertising algorithms. Advertising algorithms introduced a subtle but far-reaching transformation in how humans form desires, make choices, and interpret their own intentions. Unlike traditional advertising, which delivered the same message to large audiences, algorithmic advertising operates on personalization, prediction, and continuous adaptation. This shift fundamentally altered the cognitive boundary between choice and influence. Before algorithmic systems, advertising was visible and often recognized as persuasion. Messages were broad, repetitive, and external. Individuals could distinguish between their own preferences and commercial influence. Advertising algorithms changed this dynamic by embedding persuasion into everyday digital environments. Influence became contextual, responsive, and largely invisible. These systems operate by observing behavior rather than declared intention. Clicks, pauses, searches, and patterns are interpreted as signals. The human mind adapted to environments where actions were constantly translated into predictions. Desire was inferred before being consciously articulated. This weakened the distinction between wanting and being shown. Advertising algorithms altered how preferences were formed. Instead of discovering interests through exploration, individuals encountered curated selections aligned with past behavior. Exposure narrowed. The mind adapted to incremental reinforcement rather than novelty. Preferences became stabilized through repetition rather than reflection. This personalization reshaped perception of relevance. Content felt timely and appropriate, reinforcing trust. The mind interpreted alignment as understanding. This reduced resistance to influence. When messages matched existing inclinations, they felt less persuasive and more informational. Influence became seamless. Advertising algorithms also changed temporal dynamics of decision-making. Suggestions appeared at moments of vulnerability or readiness. Timing became as influential as content. The mind adapted to acting on impulse within optimized windows. Deliberation shortened. Decisions felt spontaneous yet were guided. The continuous feedback loop reinforced predictability. Each interaction refined future targeting. This created a self-confirming cycle. The mind encountered more of what it had already engaged with. Behavioral patterns hardened. Cognitive flexibility decreased as exploration gave way to optimization. Advertising algorithms reshaped attention. Content competed dynamically for engagement. Messages were adjusted in real time to maximize response. The mind adapted to rapid evaluation and constant stimulation. Attention became fragmented and reactive rather than sustained and intentional. These systems also influenced emotional processing. Advertising increasingly targeted emotional states rather than rational needs. Content aligned with mood, stress, or aspiration. The mind adapted to interpreting emotional cues as signals for action. Consumption became a response to internal state rather than practical requirement. The invisibility of algorithmic influence altered self-perception. Individuals continued to experience choices as autonomous. Influence operated beneath awareness. This maintained the illusion of independence while shaping behavior. The mind adapted to environments where agency felt intact but was continuously guided. Advertising algorithms also normalized behavioral surveillance. Observation became implicit and constant. The mind adapted to being measured without direct interaction. Awareness of monitoring became abstract and background. Behavior adjusted subtly without explicit acknowledgement. The scale and speed of algorithmic advertising compressed decision cycles. Options appeared instantly. Alternatives were pre-filtered. The mind adapted to selecting from presented choices rather than generating its own. Choice became selection within constraints rather than open-ended evaluation. These systems influenced identity formation. Consumption patterns reflected back as personalized feeds. Individuals saw representations of themselves through targeted content. The mind adapted to understanding identity through algorithmic mirrors. Self-concept became reinforced through external prediction. Advertising algorithms also shifted responsibility. Persuasion was no longer attributable to a visible source. Influence emerged from systems rather than messages. This diffused accountability. The mind adapted to navigating environments where cause and effect were opaque. The optimization logic behind algorithms prioritized engagement. This aligned influence with habit formation. Repetition reinforced familiarity. The mind adapted to valuing comfort and consistency. Novelty decreased unless it served engagement metrics. Importantly, advertising algorithms altered how humans understood desire itself. Wants appeared preformed and readily available. The process of wanting shortened. Reflection was replaced by recognition. The mind adapted to responding rather than initiating desire. Advertising algorithms did not eliminate free will, but they reshaped its context. Choices remained, yet the environment guiding those choices became increasingly structured. Influence moved from persuasion to prediction. Through this shift, human thinking adapted to a world where preferences were anticipated, attention was managed, and desire was shaped quietly through data-driven systems operating beyond conscious awareness. Wearable technology. Wearable technology introduced a continuous relationship between the human body and measurement, reshaping how people perceive health, performance, and self-awareness. Unlike earlier tools that were used occasionally, wearables remain in constant proximity to the body. This permanence transformed cognition by turning bodily states into streams of data. Before wearables, bodily awareness relied primarily on sensation, intuition, and occasional measurement. Fatigue, stress, and well-being were interpreted subjectively. Wearable devices converted these internal experiences into quantifiable metrics. Steps, heart rate, sleep stages, and activity levels became visible and comparable. The mind adapted to understanding the body through numbers rather than feeling alone. This quantification altered self-perception. The body became an object of observation. Internal states were externalized. Individuals learned to monitor themselves continuously. The mind adapted to evaluating well-being through dashboards and trends. Subjective experience lost authority to recorded data. Wearable technology also changed motivation. Goals were defined numerically. Daily targets provided structure. Progress was tracked visually. This reinforced compliance through feedback. The mind adapted to responding to metrics rather than internal cues. Effort became aligned with measurable outcomes. The constant presence of wearables altered attention. Bodily signals were filtered through devices. Notifications indicated movement, inactivity, or physiological change. The mind adapted to external prompts, replacing internal awareness. Self-regulation shifted from sensation to instruction. Wearables also reshaped time perception of health. Well-being became continuous rather than episodic. Trends replaced moments. The mind adapted to evaluating condition over days and weeks. This encouraged long-term thinking but reduced attention to immediate experience. The comparison enabled by wearables influenced social cognition. Metrics could be shared. Performance became visible. Individuals compared data rather than stories. The mind adapted to benchmarking physical behavior against others. Competition and conformity increased. Wearable technology reinforced trust in measurement. Data was perceived as objective. Deviations prompted concern even without symptoms. The mind adapted to interpreting numbers as truth. This reduced reliance on intuition and increased dependence on metrics. The body became a project. Improvement was continuous. There was no stable baseline. The mind adapted to constant optimization. Rest and satisfaction became conditional. Completion was replaced by maintenance. Wearables also altered the boundary between private and monitored life. Bodily data was collected continuously. Awareness of observation became normalized. The mind adapted to passive surveillance of the self. This reduced resistance to monitoring. The feedback loops created by wearables influenced emotional regulation. Achievements triggered reward. Missed goals triggered correction. Emotions became tied to data. The mind adapted to external validation of effort. Wearable technology also reshaped responsibility. Health became measurable and therefore accountable. Deviations were framed as failures to comply. The mind adapted to viewing well-being as a managed output rather than a lived state. Over time, wearables influenced identity. Individuals described themselves through metrics. Numbers replaced narratives. The mind adapted to defining self through performance indicators. Importantly, wearables reduced ambiguity. Sensations that were once unclear became labeled. This increased certainty but reduced nuance. The mind adapted to simplified interpretations of complex biological processes. Wearable technology did not simply monitor the body. It trained humans to think of themselves as data-generating systems. It shifted self-awareness from sensation to measurement, from intuition to analytics. Through this shift, human cognition adapted to continuous self-observation, optimization, and evaluation driven by numbers rather than lived experience. Cloud computing. Cloud computing introduced a fundamental shift in how humans understand ownership, presence, and the location of information. Unlike earlier computing systems tied to specific machines or physical storage, the cloud removed the visible connection between data and place. Information no longer appeared to reside anywhere in particular. This abstraction deeply altered human thinking about access, control, and permanence. Before cloud computing, data was local. Files existed on personal devices, physical drives, or identifiable servers. Ownership felt concrete. Loss was tangible. Control was direct. Cloud computing dissolved this relationship. Data became accessible from anywhere yet visibly located nowhere. The mind adapted to trusting availability without physical confirmation. This shift altered perception of possession. Information no longer felt owned in the traditional sense. It was accessed rather than held. The mind adjusted to temporary interaction instead of permanent custody. Possession became conditional on connectivity rather than proximity. Cloud computing also reshaped expectations of continuity. Work could be resumed across devices without interruption. The concept of a fixed workspace disappeared. The mind adapted to seamless transition. Context traveled independently of location. Thought became portable and uninterrupted. The abstraction of infrastructure reduced cognitive friction. Users no longer needed to understand where processes occurred. Complexity was hidden. This encouraged reliance on systems without comprehension. The mind adapted to functional trust rather than mechanical understanding. Cloud systems normalized redundancy and persistence. Data loss became less visible. Backup was implicit. This reduced anxiety around failure. The mind adapted to assuming recoverability. Risk perception shifted. Loss became abstract rather than immediate. Cloud computing also altered collaboration. Multiple individuals could interact with the same information simultaneously. Thought became shared in real time. The mind adapted to co-presence without physical proximity. Coordination replaced sequential contribution. The removal of hardware constraints influenced planning. Capacity expanded dynamically. Limits were adjustable. The mind adapted to scalable thinking. Resources felt elastic. This reduced the habit of restraint and encouraged expansion. Cloud-based access reshaped time perception. Waiting decreased. Availability became constant. The mind adapted to expecting immediate access. Delay felt abnormal. Patience declined as responsiveness increased. Cloud computing also influenced memory. Information was assumed retrievable. The mind reduced internal storage. Reliance shifted to access rather than recall. Knowledge became something summoned rather than retained. The invisibility of infrastructure altered responsibility. Failures felt external. Accountability shifted to systems. The mind adapted to attributing disruption to abstract causes rather than human action. Cloud computing reshaped security perception. Data felt both safe and vulnerable. Trust became probabilistic. The mind adapted to living with uncertainty managed by institutions rather than individuals. Importantly, cloud computing changed how humans conceptualized presence. Work, communication, and identity existed across distributed systems. The mind adapted to fragmented presence unified by access. Cloud computing did not simply store data. It reshaped cognition around access, trust, and abstraction. It trained humans to think beyond location, to rely on invisible systems, and to accept impermanence paired with availability. Through this shift, human thinking adapted to a world where information existed everywhere and nowhere at once, sustained by systems rarely seen but constantly assumed. Blockchain. Blockchain introduced a new way for humans to think about trust, verification, and collective agreement. Unlike earlier systems that relied on centralized authorities, blockchain distributed validation across networks. This shifted cognitive models of authority from institutional trust to procedural trust. Confidence no longer depended on who controlled the system, but on how the system operated. Before blockchain, verification was external. Institutions confirmed identity, ownership, and transactions. Trust was hierarchical and delegated. Blockchain replaced this structure with shared records. The mind adapted to trusting processes rather than people. Validation became mathematical and collective. The immutability of blockchain records reshaped perception of permanence. Once recorded, information could not be easily altered. This created a sense of irreversible action. The mind adapted to heightened awareness of consequence. Decisions felt final rather than revisable. Blockchain altered how time was perceived in transactions. Events were ordered cryptographically. Sequence mattered. The mind adapted to linear, verifiable histories. Memory became fixed rather than editable. The decentralization of control influenced responsibility. No single authority managed the system. The mind adapted to distributed accountability. Errors were systemic rather than personal. This reduced reliance on intermediaries. Blockchain also changed the understanding of ownership. Assets existed as entries in a shared ledger. Possession became demonstrable through cryptographic proof. The mind adapted to abstract ownership detached from physical control. The transparency of blockchain reshaped expectations of visibility. Transactions were open to verification. Privacy became selective rather than absolute. The mind adapted to partial exposure as a condition of trust. Blockchain reinforced procedural fairness. Rules applied uniformly. Enforcement was automatic. The mind adapted to predictable outcomes governed by code rather than discretion. The concept of consensus altered collective cognition. Agreement emerged through computation. The mind adapted to viewing truth as network alignment rather than authoritative declaration. Blockchain also influenced risk perception. Irreversibility increased caution. Errors could not be undone. The mind adapted to preventive thinking over corrective action. The absence of central oversight normalized self-custody. Responsibility shifted to individuals. The mind adapted to managing security directly. Loss became personal rather than institutional. Blockchain reshaped narratives of legitimacy. Validation emerged from participation. The mind adapted to legitimacy without central endorsement. Importantly, blockchain changed how humans conceptualize trust itself. Trust became embedded in systems rather than relationships. The mind adapted to relying on transparency, mathematics, and collective verification. Blockchain did not eliminate institutions, but it altered how authority was imagined. It trained human cognition to separate trust from identity and legitimacy from hierarchy. Through this shift, thinking adapted to a world where agreement emerged from structure, permanence from code, and trust from distributed systems rather than centralized power. Ending. Technologies do not simply change the tools humans use. They quietly reshape how people think, decide, remember, and trust. Each shift leaves a lasting imprint on the human mind, often long before it is fully understood. If this exploration was meaningful, support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and leaving a comment. Share this video with friends who are interested in how technology continues to shape the way we think.